I'm going to start and end the talk with a little short paragraph from a book by Gil Fronsdale called The Issue at Hand. And it's just one of the simplest, pithiest explanations of what we're doing here that I've found. And it's helpful to hear it, because we forget. Yeah? Especially on retreat. Do you have those times like, what? It happens to me every retreat at some point. It's like, why? So, and it has to do with the talk as well, so. So quite simply, the present moment is the place where we will understand the Four Noble Truths. It's a hint about the talk. As we practice, first we try to stabilize ourselves in the present moment. We settle into our body, listen to sounds, or feel the sensations of breathing. Once we are in the present moment, we can begin exploring our experience, what we are driven toward, what we push away, how we create our suffering. That's what we're doing here. We're understanding how we create our suffering and how we create our happiness. That's it. That's what we're doing. And the curiosity and interest that Sharon was speaking of last night is a really big help. Can we be interested and curious about what brings suffering and what brings happiness? See, without the glasses, I can't see this so well, but I can see you well. But with the glasses on, I can see that, and I can't see you so well. Nah. So we're going to journey back 2,560 something years ago to the time of the Buddha, to the night he sat under the Bodhi tree. And he made that resolve about his blood drying up. He would not move, even if his blood dried up, until he understood the deepest truths of what could be understood. And of course, Mara comes and challenges and tries to get him off his seat. And of course, the Buddha holds firm. Very interesting, though, just a little tangent. So Mara tried to scare the Buddha, and the Buddha's just like, no. And then Mara tried to entice the Buddha, and again, nothing, just not even moving. But then Mara pulls out his trump card, right? Nothing's working. So he has to pull out his final thing, his trump card. What right do you have to be sitting there? He tried to instill self-doubt into the Buddha. And that is when the Buddha reached down, and you could read into it, asked for help. So this self-doubt that we struggle with, just to say, we're not alone. Well, that's not what the talk is. So once he vanquished Mara, and Mara went off, he settled down to meditating, deep meditation. And during that night of meditation, he woke up to the truth of how things are. In the first watch of the night, he woke up to the truth of his rebirth. He saw all his past lives. And actually, these three things that he woke up to are really all the same thing. They're just different facets of it. And then the second watch of the night, he woke up to how it is that whole cycle of birth and death and rebirth and suffering, how that all happens. He saw actually like what the engine was. Saw it very clearly. And that's, if you know the teachings of the 12 links of dependent co-arising. And then in the third watch of the night, it is said, right when the morning star was fading, he woke up to the Four Noble Truths. So then he started teaching. And the very first thing he taught, the very first sermon that he gave, was a teaching on the Four Noble Truths. So that should say something to us about the importance of these teachings. And what he did, what the Buddha, he decided to express what he understood just in the way he did. Suffering and its cause. The end of suffering and its cause, or how to get there. You can really you can really see the Four Noble Truths as suffering and its cause and happiness and its cause. That's it. But he chose to do it the way he did for a couple of reasons. It was quite brilliant, actually. One is it's a medical model. What is the ailment? What is the cause of the ailment? Can that ailment be cured? If so, what is the course of medicine, or what is the course of action? And he did that because people at that time already knew that. I mean, there were doctors back then, and that was a model that they were using. So he expressed it in a way that people, in a form or a format that people already understood. And that's how he always taught. He taught in a way, in a language and with analogies that were appropriate to the people that he was teaching. The other really important reason that he chose to express what he understood in this way is because it being a medical model, or it being expressed in this way, that it was very pragmatic. You didn't have to sign up and believe a certain set of doctrines, or believe in some cosmology, or have some faith in some system of belief in order to practice and know these truths for yourself. There was no dogma involved, nothing you had to sign up for. All you had to do is look at your own experience. And that's huge, and that was huge in those times. If you remember, or if you know, it was the, what were they called? I'm blanking on it now. Well, like the priests that supposedly held all the knowledge. And so it was like he was undercutting their power base by doing this. He's saying, no, you don't need anyone else or any system of beliefs in order to be happy and free. All you have to do is look at your own experience. So this was really radical. And I think that's why a lot of us are attracted to this spiritual path. We don't have to take anything as kind of blind belief. We don't have to, assign ourselves to some cosmology or some dogma. We just have to look at our own experience. Now, the Buddha was completely omniscient. He knew everything there was to know about everything. And sometimes, very little, but sometimes he would kind of hint at or talk a little bit about what he knew, about parallel world systems and parallel universes and just this like mind-blowing cosmology. But he didn't really teach about that very much. And there's this, what he taught about is what would lead us to the end of suffering. And there's this famous sutta where the Buddha is standing with, I'm not sure if it's Ananda or one of his other disciples, but he says, do you see all these leaves in the forest? And the person says, yeah. And he said, are these leaves few or many? And the person said, they're many. And then the Buddha picked up a handful of leaves and said, do you see these leaves? Are these leaves few or many? And the person said, well, these leaves are few. And then the Buddha said, these leaves in the forest, these represent what I know. That's how much I know. These leaves in my hand, this is what I teach. And he said, why? Because only this is what's important. Only this is what's necessary to free the heart from suffering. So that was like, right from the get-go, that's why he taught. For one reason and one reason only, the complete release of the heart and mind. So, his first sermon, he started teaching it. He started teaching the Four Noble Truths. Dukkha and its cause, which is tanha, our craving. That there is an end, that there is a release, that there's a complete extinguishment, nibbana, or enlightenment. And then the way to do that, the Eightfold Path. Each of these truths has a mandate to it. It's something that we're supposed to do with it. It's a way that we are supposed to kind of hold it or work with it. And it's really important to know this and remember it, because it points to how to get free. And the first one, the truth of dukkha, or suffering, and we'll pick that apart in a few minutes. But the truth of dukkha is to be understood. Sometimes the word experienced is used. Experienced or understood. Meaning we're to connect with it. The second noble truth, tanha or craving, is to be abandoned. That's what we're supposed to do with it. The third noble truth is to be enlightenment, nibbana, is to be realized. That's what we want to do. We want to realize this truth for ourselves. We want to realize the end of suffering. And then the fourth noble truth, the Eightfold Path, is to be developed or cultivated. So this evening, I'm just going to talk about the first two noble truths and how they relate to one another, especially how they relate to one another. So dukkha is the first truth. Most commonly, and we hear it all the time and use it because it's not a terrible translation, it's just not completely correct as suffering. But the reason it's not correct, it doesn't speak to the breadth of the type of suffering that dukkha covers. So words like unreliable, unsatisfactory, stress, agitation, not quite right, are some words that kind of better flesh out the range of experience that the Pali word dukkha points to. So literally the word dukkha means something like to not fit properly. And the analogy that's used in the teachings are an axle that doesn't quite fit right in the hub, and the agitation, the grinding, that would result from that. There are three different, you could say, levels or types of dukkha, and we'll look at these, and this will help us get a really good understanding of the range of this word dukkha. The first way we experience dukkha is called dukkha. And what that points to are the kind of ordinary aches and pains, you might say, of the body and of the mind. So when we stub our toe, when we get jealous, when we get sick, when we get angry. These are ways that we suffer. They're difficult experiences. Yeah? Stubbing your toe is a difficult experience. Getting sick is a difficult experience. Having anger or jealousy in the heart and mind is a difficult experience. Ow. It hurts. Painful. The second type of dukkha that we experience is called, so the first one is dukkha. The second one is called viparinami dukkha, and it is the dukkha associated, or associated with change. Things change and we don't like it. We grow old, maybe, and we don't like it. Or, and this is such a perfect, I think, example of it, or at least that's how I felt it. Let's say you're on vacation. Let's say it's a 7-day vacation. And it's late afternoon on day 4. Yeah? That's Viparinami Dukkha. Right there. Right when it hits you, it's coming. And that feeling, that's it, right there. You know, I work, my day job is in the institution of IMS, and it's an institution. It has cogs and wheels, and it is a full-blown institution. And it has staff people that do different jobs, and there are policies and procedures, and sometimes, believe it or not, those policies and procedures change. And you'd be surprised how much we have to remind ourselves we don't like change. We just, the unenlightened mind resists change. So this is a little bit more insidious. Like you stub your toe, ow, that's kind of a gross level. That moment on the afternoon of day 4, that's a little bit subtler. Yet still, it's like, And then the most subtle level of dukkha is called sankhara dukkha. And what this is the unsatisfactory experience of having 6 sense doors, right? 5 of the body and 1 to the mind, that we can't control. We can't shut them off. And they are constantly being impinged on with sense objects. That, just to use it's not really bombardment, but that bombardment, there can be a sense of And sometimes this kind of type of dukkha is often only noticed when we're really, really quiet, maybe in a meditation retreat. Just this sense of the sense doors being impinged upon. Even if it's pleasant, doesn't matter. And it's like you can't turn it off. There's no switch. And when we feel that, there's no switch. There is no turning this off. It's like, whoa. That's why we get our rest from those 4 hours of rapid eye movement sleep, because it does get turned off. That's why we rest. That's also why very deep concentration, where it all does get temporarily turned off, is just like dreamless sleep. It's just, one can rest just as much in that state as in dreamless sleep. It's because the sense doors aren't being impinged upon. So this is the most subtle level of dukkha. And we can feel into this even though if we're not, in deep samadhi. The way you can connect with this type of dukkha is just kind of what we have to do to keep this body going. Brush the teeth, take a shower, go to work, buy the food, cook the food, clean up after the food, go to the bathroom. Have you ever kind of felt like it's kind of drudgery? Yeah? That's like a kind of a gross level of sankhara dukkha. Here we are, we got born, and now there's all this stuff we have to keep doing. It's like the incessantness of it. So those are the 3, that's the range of dukkha. From something as gross as stubbing your toe to something as subtle as the impact, the incessant impact on our sense doors. But why are these suffering? This is a question we want to ask ourselves. Do we have to suffer when we stub our toe? Do we have to suffer on day 4 of our vacation? Or when we grow old? Or any of these ways? Is suffering completely bound up in these experiences? Because if it is, we're in deep doo-doo. Right? Because we can't stop these experiences. So of course, the answer to this question is no. It's not bound up in them. We don't have to suffer. So, and then the next question is, well, if we don't have to suffer, then why do we? Right? These teachings are very pragmatic. Why do we then? And of course, that brings us to the cause of dukkha, the cause of suffering. In the Pali, this word is called tanha, and again, usually translated as craving, which is a good translation, and it actually means, the word actually means thirst. I'm going to read a few things about from Ajahn Chah this evening. Ajahn Chah is a wonderful teacher from the Thai forest tradition of Ajahn Mun, and kind of one of the main streams in our lineage of Vipassana here in the West that we practice. The other mainstream being the Mahasi Sayadaw tradition of Burma. It's like a man with a strong thirst from having traveled a long way. He asks for water, but the person with the water tells him, "You can drink this water if you want. Its color is good, its smell is good, its flavor is good, but it's poisonous. I want you to know. It can poison you to death or give you pains like death." But the thirsty man won't listen because he's so thirsty. Or like a person after surgery, he's been told by the doctor not to drink water, but he asks for water to drink. A person thirsty for sensuality is like this, thirsty for sights, thirsty for sounds, for smells, for tastes, all of which are poisonous. The Buddha tells us that sight, sounds, smells, tastes, tactile sensations, and ideas, thoughts in the mind, are poisonous. They're traps, but we don't listen to him. Like the man thirsty for water who won't listen to the warning because his thirst is so great. No matter how much trouble or pain he'll get into, all he asks for is water to drink. He doesn't care if after he drinks the water he'll die or suffer pains like death. As soon as he gets his hands on a glass, he keeps on drinking. There are 3 types of craving. Craving for sense pleasures, which Ajahn Chah was just talking about. And when we say craving for sense pleasures, remember, this is automatically assuming, the wanting for what's pleasant, we're also automatically assuming the not wanting of what's unpleasant. Yeah? That's all together in the word craving. Okay, it covers both. So craving for sense pleasures, craving for becoming, and craving for non-becoming. Craving for becoming, what's that? When I get that blank, then it'll be good. Craving for non-becoming, when I get rid of that blank, then it'll be good. Craving is really a big thing that we explore in this practice. It's actually most of what we explore. The difficulty with craving is that to some degree, we can connect with pleasurable experiences and keep the unpleasant ones away. We can do it actually quite a bit, especially those of ourselves who are you would say, in the privileged kind of class or space in this world. We have lots of resources at our disposal with which to bring to bear on this pleasure seeking. I forgot where I was. So there's a way that we can get lulled into thinking that, hey, this works. This actually works. Thinking if we can just kind of tweak it enough and get it right, this keeping things pleasant, then we'll be happy. Sense pleasures take us on a ride. The ride can be quite pleasant, but it always comes to an end. You always have to get off that ride. Have you noticed? Is there any sense pleasure ride you haven't had to get off of? And then when you get off, you haven't gotten anywhere. All you've gotten is, forever how long it was, that much closer to death. That's as far as you've gotten. Have you ever been to a really terrible movie? And you come out and you just go, what a waste of time. Like you really feel it. I just wasted 2 hours of my life. Yeah, everyone has that experience. Same thing. It's the exact same thing. Except when we see the really terrible movie, we are in touch with the fact that we just wasted 2 hours of our life. When we're not aware of this whole realm that we're exploring tonight, we don't know it. And we're going to explore that much more about why that's so important. The other thing is, when we go on these rides, it's much more likely that we're going to hop on the next sense pleasure ride when it comes along. We're going to be even more habituated to do that. This is the other difficulty with craving. The more we do it, the more we need to do it. It's an addiction, and it follows the same patterns that all addictions follow. It's an addiction because it doesn't work. The ride stops and always leaves us wanting. This, and precisely right this, is what the Pali word samsara means. If you've heard that word. This wandering onwards from beginningless time, looking for the ride we don't have to get off of. And it's not to be found. And we keep looking. That's the cycle of samsara. It just keeps going. There's no end to it. There's no end to the looking. Erase that. There is an end to it. But there's no end to it through looking. For all these reasons, craving causes us to suffer. Now, if we didn't care that we suffered, this whole thing would be a non-issue. None of us would even be sitting here right now. If we didn't care that we suffered, none of anything I'm saying, anything we're doing here would matter. We'd be back home right now chasing pleasant experiences because it wouldn't matter. But we do care. Remember I was talking about it being built into the hard drive? We want to know what's true, meaning we don't want to suffer. So we do care. And therefore, it is of the utmost importance that we find out what causes that suffering. Because when we find out, we stop doing it. Not all at once, but over time, we will stop doing it. That's the trajectory we want to be on. This is basically what the Buddha taught. Notice what causes suffering and stop doing it. Notice what causes happiness and keep doing it. Sometimes I can just I have this image of the Buddha in my mind going, stop it. Just stop it. And this is, of course, is what's in that famous sutta that Sharon brought up last night, the Buddha's instructions to his son Rahula. Every thought, every word, and every action, before you do it, consider, will this bring happiness or bring suffering to myself or others? If so, don't do it. While you're doing it, if so, stop doing it. After you do it, if you look and see that it brought suffering, then you form the intention, the resolve not to do it again. So we look and see what brings, then he goes to happiness. And if it is, then you are to do it or keep doing it and can do it again in the future. It's very pragmatic. Look and see what causes happiness. Keep doing it. What causes suffering? Stop it. Don't do it. The Buddha said, I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and its end. And when we first hear that, we think, that's two things. That's not one thing. That's two things. I hope by the end of this talk you'll see that it actually is one thing. So as we know, the ending of suffering, or dukkha, is what this practice is all about. It's the goal, it's the only reason the Buddha taught it. So we know that. But how do we end suffering? Remember the mandates that are given for each of the noble truths, and that's where the answer lies. We abandon the cause of suffering, which is craving. Okay, straightforward, we know that. That sounds nice and neat, just abandon craving. But how do we abandon craving? As you all know from your own experience, not from a Dharma talk or anything, from your own experience, that this is an extremely powerful and deep habit pattern in our hearts and minds. So we need some help in doing this. It is a formidable thing. It is a formidable force in our lives. And we need help. We need some instruction on how to do it. Fortunately, the Buddha left us with very good instructions, as he basically always did. The way to end craving is to see everything that we cling to displays what's called the three universal characteristics of experience. These are the insights of insight meditation. They are anicca, dukkha, and anatta in Pali, or impermanence or change. Dukkha, we know we're talking about suffering, and anatta means not self. It doesn't mean no self. It means not self. Just want to go through each of them very quickly, and you'll see why. Anatta, not self. All things are not self. They are not ours. They don't belong to us. All things. They will follow their own nature, regardless of whether we want them to follow their own nature or not. Who here has a child? They're going to follow their own nature. Especially those of you who have some older children, 20s, they're going to follow their own nature. They do not belong to you. This beautiful weather. I can't believe how delicious it is out there. It's going to follow its own nature. We don't control it. It doesn't belong to us, meaning it's going to change. It's going to rain. It's going to get cold. Summer will end. They are not in our control. Therefore, how could they be us? And of course, those are just two examples. This applies to everything. Every thought, every part of your body, everything we think is us follows its own nature. It is beyond our control. It is not I, it's not self, it's anatta, not self. And again, this is true for everything we can know at our six sense doors. Everything in this world, in this universe. Second, all things are impermanent, anicca. They follow their own nature, whether we want them to or not. Remember the vacation analogy? The vacation's going to follow its own nature. It's going to end, whether we want it to or not. We're going to grow older, whether we want to or not. Everything is going to change, whether we want it to or not. It's going to follow its nature. When we resist things following their nature, we suffer. Instead of being at ease with the way things are, there's struggle. We struggle with life. It's like we're wrestling with life. If you've ever been in a really, like a swift stream, like not just up to your ankles, but like mid thighs, yeah? It's a struggle, right? You have to lean into it and you're being buffeted and knocked off balance. It's a struggle. But what if you just lifted your feet up, kicked back? Then we wouldn't be struggling with the nature of the stream, because the nature of the stream is to flow that way, and we're like standing still. Like, no, I'm not going to flow that way. I'm going to stand here. So we struggle. When we are in accord with the nature of the way things are, we're floating down the stream on our back. And this is perhaps the most important, certainly the most immediate instruction the Buddha left us as to how to end craving. Remember, we're talking about how to do this. How did he tell us how to do it? And that is, we experience right in the moment with what's arising in our own hearts and minds that suffering is intrinsically linked or bound to craving. We see that. Here's where it really gets interesting. We know that tanha, or craving, is the cause of dukkha. Yeah? But what's the cause of craving? Remember the mandate for dukkha? It must be experienced. We must wake up to it and not be ignorant of it. We have to know it. It must be known. It must be experienced. We can't be ignorant of it, of the truth of it, this first noble truth. What do I mean by being ignorant of dukkha? When we're full and decide to eat dessert, that's ignorance of dukkha. When we don't have the money and buy something on credit, that's ignorance of dukkha. When we say something that causes someone else to be upset, that's ignorance of dukkha. When we don't see how we're causing difficulty, we don't see it, and so we do it. Do you know the answer now to what is the cause of craving? Ignorance of dukkha. When we don't see dukkha, we crave. This is how linked they are. When we don't experience the suffering caused by craving, we ignore dukkha and create the conditions that support craving, namely ignorance of dukkha. Can you see how intertwined these two truths are? I teach one thing and one thing only, suffering and its end. Actually, all the Four Noble Truths are this intertwined, but we're just looking at the first two this evening. Craving is the cause for suffering, and ignorance of suffering is the cause of craving. Abandoning craving is the cure for suffering, and contacting or knowing the experience of suffering is the cure, is the way to abandon craving. Here's another story from Ajahn Chah about what happens when we don't understand this. Oof. No, just that it's long and I'm looking at the time. I'm going to skip it. It just says that. It's about the snake. There's a snake and you grab it and and it bites you, all right. That's the story. He does it better, but... So how do we see this for ourselves? How do we see the ignorance of dukkha is the cause of craving? Again, the Buddha left detailed instructions. It's called being mindful. That's how we do it. We pay attention to our experience. And we pay attention to understand our experience, not to judge our experience. What is it we want to pay attention to? What is it we want to understand? Many things, but most important one is to see when there is wanting or not wanting in our hearts and minds. To see when craving is present. That's what we want to see. And further, to see, to experience right in that moment that it's bound to suffering. To see, to feel, to experience the suffering that is concomitant with that craving. That's what we want to see. That's what we want to understand. But if we are averse to craving, if we see, craving bad, we see that in our mind, or even any subtlest form of that, we won't be able to understand it. We might be able to notice that it's there, but if we judge it or ourselves for the fact that it is there, the judging, the aversion, it's going to color our experience. This is exactly why Pat was talking over and over again about welcoming the difficult mind states. Because if we push them away and we're averse to them, we can't understand them. This is so important. This is why we look at our experience. We don't go, ew. We look at it. Suffering must be understood. This is the interest and the curiosity that Sharon was talking about. What is this? What's happening with it? What does it cause? What's going on? We can't do that if we go, ugh. When we're meditating, it is much more important to know why the mind wandered than that it wandered. That makes sense? We want to focus much more on why than that it wandered in the first place. It doesn't matter that it wandered at all. But it matters why. Don't dwell on the fact that it wandered. Look and see why it wandered. If that it wandered is predominant in your experience, that's judgment. If why it's wandered is predominant in your experience, that's discernment. Two very different things. This is one of the main ways we investigate our experience. Looking. Why did the mind wander? What was that? And what effect did it have? Is it having on me right now? What are the ways to really make the connection between that craving causes suffering? What's the best way to do this? I can recognize craving in my heart and mind. But how do I connect it to suffering? You keep telling me, connect it to suffering. See that it's concomitant with it. How? How do I do that? again, detailed instructions. There is a sutta that you may be aware of called the Satipatthana Sutta. It's the Buddha's instructions for meditation. There's actually very few places in the suttas where the Buddha says, this is how you do it. Mostly he's talking about wisdom. There's very few places where he tells us how to meditate. And the Satipatthana Sutta is the sutta where he talks about how to meditate. The 4 foundations are the 4 frames of mindfulness. And the first foundation or frame is mindfulness of the body. And the very first exercise in mindfulness of the body is mindfulness of breathing. So this is pretty foundational stuff. That exercise in breathing brings us to a place of breathing in. The last instruction is breathing in and out, calming the breath body. So those instructions bring us to a place of stillness in the body, of calm, of ease in the body, somewhat in the mind, but especially in the body. The body becomes very still, becomes an exquisite instrument. So we use the instructions from the Satipatthana Sutta, knowing the body from the inside out, getting very intimate with this still body, this vibrational instrument that we can be aware of. And we use exactly that to teach us. Because our bodies are always truthful. They will never lie to us. When you stub your toe, your body does not produce feelings of, that feels good, right? It produces feelings of, ow, painful feelings. The mind can deceive us to no end. Oh, this will make you happy, when really it won't. Remember the dessert? We're full. Cake. You can tell I'm a greed type. All my examples are about desire. The mind can deceive us to no end, but the body is always truthful. So, when you wake up from your favorite pleasant fantasy, check the body. If we started out, or it's not just an on or off switch, to the degree that we started out with a body that's calm, open, relaxed, we're connected to that experience, after we wake up from that pleasant ride we just got on, and we look back on the body, we're going to feel agitation, contraction, something, tension. Why? Because the body is truthful. Because there was just craving in the mind. And craving is concomitant with suffering. And the body will show us. It will be truthful of that fact. We will feel it in the body. That still, peaceful body is the benchmark. And compared to that benchmark, that agitation, that slight tension we feel from being on that ride, we see it, we feel it, we experience it in the moment as suffering. Not like huge suffering, but compared to that peaceful body, it's very clear, I'd rather have that than this. And that's one of the, it's not the only way, but it's one of the best ways to see the connection between craving and suffering. Feel it in your own body. It's not peaceful. It's not at ease when the body is tense. This is where that sutta was pointing to. Remember Sharon was saying last night, how's that going for you? How was it to be on that ride? Check and see. Be curious, investigate. How was that? Now remember, we're not going to be able to do this if we're freaking out because, I had a pleasant fantasy again. That's the judging. Whole thing stops there. All there is now is judging in the mind, and that's just more suffering. Which is why Pat was saying over and over again, we have to invite it in. If we judge it, then all bets are off. There's nothing more to do. Well, we can notice the judging and work with that, but in terms of what I'm talking about, it all stops. Look back at the effects of those thought trains. How's it going for you? How did that play out? Check your body and you'll see. So we've taken birth, and if we take birth, we're going to come into contact with all three types of dukkha that I spoke about. It's not all we'll come into contact with. We'll come into contact with all sorts of other things, really pleasant things. But we will for sure come into contact with dukkha. It's part of taking birth in this body, in this realm. It's just the package deal. Now this is actually not a problem, or at least it doesn't have to be a problem. Remember, the Buddha experienced these. He experienced in the body, right? He had back pain. He experienced dukkha. He experienced the difficulty of losing his two best friends in the same year. He experienced that sense of loss. But as I said, he also said, and isn't it amazing that Tathagata does not suffer over this loss? There is this suffering. So we're going to come into contact with dukkha. We just are. So there's the suffering that leads to more suffering, and the suffering that leads to the end of suffering. Another story, but I don't have time. Right. The suffering that leads to more suffering, or the suffering that leads to the end of suffering? And the $10 million question for us is, what type of suffering are we going to experience? And the thing that's going to allow us to choose, that will allow us to extract ourselves, or at least begin to extract ourselves from this mess of suffering we've gotten ourselves into, is mindfulness. We use mindfulness to see when craving is present in the heart and mind. And we use mindfulness to see what the result of that craving is, that dis-ease, that agitation, that non-contentment. It's mindfulness that notices that. When we see this, we undermine craving, the cause of suffering, and the whole thing starts to unravel. That whole chain of causality that the Buddha saw on the second watch of the night, it starts to unravel. Actually, it starts to go the other way. It starts to turn in the other direction. When we're not mindful and we don't see this, the pattern just continues. Samsara just rolls on. So you can see now why I teach one thing and one thing only is really one thing. Suffering and its end. When we see suffering, it undermines craving, the cause of craving, which is the cause of suffering. It's one thing. We live in a world now, though, that has its share of both pleasant and unpleasant experiences. we can't crawl under a rock and hide. That's not like what the practice is about. If enlightenment was just plugging up all our sense doors, our 5 sense doors, and giving ourselves a lobotomy, then we could just do it and it'd be done. But that's not how it works. We can't hide from these experiences. That's not how we get free from them. We're going to come into contact with both pleasant and unpleasant. So what's the skillful way to approach these things? All right, I am going to read this story. Living with a cobra. Remember, this is Southeast Asia. Remember this. All the objects of the mind, regardless of whether they are things you like or things you don't like, are like poisonous cobras. If they attack and bite you, you can die. Objects are like cobras whose poison is fierce. The objects we like have lots of poison. The objects we don't like have lots of poison. They can keep the mind from being free. They can make it go astray from the principles of the Buddha Dharma. Another one, leaving the cobra alone. Objects and moods of the mind are like cobras whose poison is fierce. If nothing gets in the way of the cobra, it slithers along in line with its nature. Even though it contains poison, it doesn't show it. It doesn't show it. It doesn't cause us any danger because we don't get near it. The cobra just goes along in line with its cobra affairs. It keeps going that way. If you're intelligent, if you leave everything alone, you leave good things alone, you leave bad things alone, you leave the things you like alone, in the same way you leave a poisonous cobra alone. You let it slither along on its way. It slithers along even though it contains poison. He was just a masterful teacher. He really was. When we see craving in the mind, this is how to practice with it. When we see any form of wanting or not wanting in the mind, we can see that it's just wanting or not wanting. And it's just following its nature. It's desire that desires. It's anger that angers. Worry worries, etc. Cobras slither. It's not you. It's just the cobra slithering by. If you don't pick it up, it won't bother you. Let worry worry. Let anger anger. Let it do what it does. Let it come and let it go, because that's also part of its nature. It will slither by. It will go. Don't mess with it. That's what Pat was talking about. Leave the cobra alone. Let it follow its nature. Let desire desire. Let worry worry. Let anger anger. Let them follow their nature. There are many pleasant objects we're going to come into contact with. There's lots of cobras. We can't help it. And we're not supposed to. It's not the problem. Again, we're not supposed to crawl under a rock. Where we get into trouble is thinking that these pleasant objects can deliver what our heart desires. That's the ride. That pleasant object, that's the ride. This is unwise view. We try to hold on to them and we won't let them go. And the story I didn't read you was, we pick a snake up by the tail and don't let it go, we get bit. But if we have wise view, then there's not a problem with these pleasant sense experiences. There's no problem. When we don't think that these experiences will bring us what our hearts most desire, then we'll tend not to cling to them. Again, we don't pick them up. We don't mess with the cobra. Doesn't mean we don't experience them. We still experience them, but we don't heap on top of them our, we don't pin our hopes of freedom. We don't pin our heart's deepest desires on them. That's what we don't do. That's not picking up the cobra. It's like holding the snake by the back of the head. That's how we contact a cobra. We're safe if we do it that way. If we contact pleasant sense experiences with wise view, then we're safe. Then we can come into contact with all the sense experiences we want, and it's no problem. And we can enjoy them. The Buddha said, sense pleasures are to be enjoyed. That's what they're for. That's why they're here. So here's something interesting. I'm a little over. Probably like 4 more minutes, just so you'll know you're not trapped. So when you're doing walking meditation, here's right where the rubber will meet the road. When you're doing walking meditation and you look up at pleasant surroundings, do it with wise view. Don't do it with unwise view. Unwise view is, I'm bored at looking at the ground and feeling my feet. Let me get on a ride that's better. Let me pin my hopes for happiness on something else. That would be looking up with unwise view. Looking up with wise view is, it's gorgeous out, it's lovely. Let me pause and just take it in for a moment, knowing that this isn't going to bring me my heart's deepest desire, and I can enjoy it. And you can extrapolate that to infinitum, to everything. All right, that's enough words. The whole thing rests on being mindful. This whole talk, everything that we're supposed to do, notice, get curious about, it all rests on being mindful. So when you're sitting there, feeling your breath, or noticing your body, and you can't remember why the heck you're doing it, remember, you are cultivating the condition itself that supports the end of suffering. Mindfulness is the key. Okay, I'm going to read this again now. So, quite simply, the present moment is the place where we will understand the Four Noble Truths. As we practice, first we try to stabilize ourselves in the present moment. We practice mindfulness. We settle into our body, mindfulness of the body. Listen to sound, mindfulness of sound. Or feel the sensations of breathing, mindfulness of breathing. Once we are in the present moment, we can begin exploring our experience. That word, investigating. What are we driven toward? What do we push away? How do we create our suffering? This is our practice. So we're not going to sit quietly for a minute because we're already late. So thank you for listening, and I hope in some way that this talk is helpful to you with your practice. Enjoy the warm, lovely, sense pleasure evening out there. Enjoy it. Just know its limitations.